by Dr. Shaunna Rodrigues. I'm happy to say that, delighted to say that Shaunna was my student many years ago. And she remembered a point that I made in class, which I think is more a reflection of her brightness rather than my ability to teach. So, Shaunna, without any further ado, let's hear what you have to say, and then we will open it for discussion. So 40 minutes, is that okay?
Sure. Right. 40 minutes. Should I go there?
Yeah.
Okay. This one? Okay. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. And I want to start by thanking the Maulana Azad Chair here at MANUU, Professor Imtiaz Hasnain, for welcoming me to this university with such kindness and warmth, and for organizing this two-day event to discuss Azad's life and political ideas. I'm grateful to Professor Syed Ainul Hassan, Professor S.K. Ishtiaq, Professor Ehtisham Khan, and everyone else here who has helped organize this event. And I'm thrilled that I get to learn from scholars such as Dr. Irfan Habib, Dr. Amir Ali, Dr. Mohammad Sajjad, and Danish Iqbal, and all of you who are present here today. I'm really glad that we are having this discussion in Hyderabad. Jamal al-Din Afghani gave his lecture, which we were discussing earlier today, the commentary on the commentator here in Hyderabad. And it was, the site of thinking about what it means to participate in politics, in anti-colonial politics, in such a, it was a thriving environment. So I'm happy to be here in Hyderabad as well. My paper today is titled Azad's Anti-Colonialism, World-Making, Non-Secular Progress, and Self-Respect in India. I don't know whether I'll reach the end of the paper because it's quite long, but I will start it by demarcating the possibilities and limitations of writing and thinking about anti-colonialism before moving to the three major conceptions that I think shape Azad's anti-colonial thought, that is world-making, non-secular progress, and self-respect. Before I start, a note on method. I think there is a difference in the way in which this paper was written and how I'm going to read it out today. When I read it out today, I'm going to start with what is abstract in Azad's thought, because I want to focus on what in his thought can be replicated elsewhere and therefore is of theoretical value. And then I will move to narrowing it into the more detailed words, thoughts, actions, events, processes, and ideologies that Azad, that Azad developed his thought in response to. This is not necessarily how I have arrived at my conclusions about Azad as a thinker. I arrived at my conclusions in a converse manner, that is by moving from his more historical writings and then coming to understand what he is saying in a more abstract realm. So let me start. The reason why I'm doing this is there is a threefold reason. One, I want to highlight what a remarkable and deep thinker he was. We all know him as a scholar, as a political activist, a journalist, but rarely as a philosopher or a theorist. And the second, so that we can arrive at a conclusion on what general insights can be gained from Azad's thought that is relevant to anti-colonialism everywhere, and not just what is particular to Azad as an Indian nationalist thinker. And the third reason is so that we can examine how political and social concepts shaped by Azad's anti-colonial thought can and ought to shape Indian public life today in our contemporary moment, a moment of crisis for pluralism, democracy, and Islam in India. Finally, on the aims of this paper, in addition to thinking about Azad's political thought itself, this paper will ask and examine why his political thought has been marginalized, not only in India, but in anti-colonial writings across the globe. In particular, I will comment on three reasons why I think Azad's Islamic yet universalist thought has been sidelined. First is because of forces of liberal imperialism that continue to hegemonically influence how liberal ideas ought to shape political life in India rather than pluralist ideas drawn from other worldviews, such as Islam. Second is because of a Nehruvian form of secularism that came to be practiced in India, which upholds pluralism but does not take arguments emerging from religious worldviews as important in shaping the political conception that is a secular India today. So I'm going to be a little critical of Nehru, if that is okay with everyone. And the third is Hindu nationalism, with its limited emphasis on territorial and majoritarian nationalism, has repeatedly proven itself incapable of developing tolerant forms of mutual coexistence between the diverse people of this country. Now let me move into this paper where in the next section I'm going to just maybe a short note on different kinds of anti-colonialism. Studies on anti-colonialism are not a new phenomenon, and Indian anti-colonialism was studied much before we had independence. Despite this, over the years, the term anti-colonial has been shed and replaced with nationalism in India. The movement for independence in India is rarely called the anti-colonial movement for independence. It is called the national movement for independence. And in doing so, we have confined the thought of thinkers like Azad, who wrote and thought not just for Indians, to Indian nationalism. Writing influenced by different kinds of nationalism in India rightly characterized Azad as a pluralist, but his pluralism is often read through the historically particular lens of Indian nationalism rather than through a more general lens of anti-colonialism. And there is an obvious limitation to this because in using nationalism to express a larger phenomenon of anti-colonialism, we might be ignoring several ideas that are not nationalist in Azad's thinking. There's another kind of writing on anti-colonialism which has gained coverage recently, which moves beyond nationalist thought to study what scholars call a global anti-colonialism. However, much of the focus of such global anti-colonialism has been on Marxist revolutionaries, whose non-nationalist approach to anti-colonialism primarily emerged from traveling across the globe and building solidarities among socialists and communists elsewhere. However, this lens of studying anti-colonialism has two limitations. First, it employs a secular lens, one that does not acknowledge religious arguments as relevant to the public domain. And second, it focuses on mobility and travel as a mode of thinking of the quote-unquote global, and therefore undermines the potential of those who dwelled in places in the colonized world to speak for the rest of the globe. So now let me move into Azad's thought. And I have titled this section Azad's World Making. I think there are two prominent concepts of world making that we find in Azad's thought. The first is a conception of world making, which refers to the inevitable totality of involvements in which a people who shape a world dwell in. This totality of involvements includes the historical, linguistic, cultural, and social contexts that are regularly and repeatedly disclosed in the interactions of people with institutions, relations, objects, and conversations that surround them, thus making the world they inhabit. Such a world is not necessarily active or even consciously shaped by people. Rather, it tries to capture how a world is made and remade when the people who dwell in it inexorably observe, interact in, and interpret it by throwing forward the world that they are born into or dwell in their everyday lives. Azad placed an emphasis on being conscious of such a form of world making and disclosing it as much as possible. As the idea of Indian nationalism gained ground in the interwar period, that's the period from 1920s to the 1930s, particularly after the Khilafat movement, Azad paid attention to this conception of world making through ideas of placemaking, where placemaking referred to the modes through which individuals interacted with the physical environment or the space in which they dwelled in, imbuing it with practices, values, and overlapping identities of the diverse people who lived in the place that is India. And placemaking, according to me, was crucial to Azad to reflect on how the world which is centered in India ought to be defined as plural. He used different terms to mark how he constituted place: Darul Islam, Maqam, Watan, Jaga, and land. Across these terms, place acted as a concept of composition that could gather political affiliation to a space possibly larger than the territorial borders of the Indian nation, but something which could collectively be interpreted as a space smaller than the dispersed transnational world of empires. Am I going too fast? No. Okay. Azad rejected an orientation towards thinking of place via boundaries. One should not, he contended, attach too much prejudice in defining the horizons of dwelling, as the establishment of such limits usually stemmed from a desire for superiority. This is from an essay in Al-Hilal titled Islam or Nationalism. Azad was undoubtedly the most important political thinker in disputing the geographically detached and spatially abstract invention of Pakistan as a nation. He did so not only by upholding the multi-religious composition of India, a common ideological point that he shared with others who opposed the idea of Pakistan, like Madani Saab, but he also was insightful about heralding a transition from imperial rule to new ways of world making. He often pointed out that he was, quote, wandering between two worlds, one dead and the other powerless to be born. However, his political thought and praxis faced a primary predicament. Islamic imaginaries formulated in distant spaces, such as Turkey, circulated with ease in India during the critical juncture in which he was politically active. But neither were they at the center of the emerging national imaginary in India, nor were they sufficient in preventing what he called misunderstandings and fear about whether Swaraj or self-rule would mean Hindu Raj or the dominance of Hindus in India. What then could tie Islamic worlds to the idea of an Indian nation, which was now taking a national form in the interwar period? In order to answer this question, Azad argued that God's universal providence or rububiyat had created a world which could not commonly or politically be assessed via similitude with human life, expressing how a place or a space gathered man's relationship to it entirely through conditions of human possibility was epistemically limiting for a political imagination in which dwelling in a place was crucial. It was the acknowledgement of the impossibility of human knowledge to completely understand how providence impacted their relationship with place that became crucial to Azad's theorization of pluralism in India. Within this approach to dwelling, the Islamic idea of humanity's universal access to all of the mundane world and nature, or arsiyat, helped Azad understand how the relationship between humans and place was not an inert idea, but composed a universal horizon for all of humanity. Azad makes this clear in an article titled Islam or Nationalism, published in his journal Al-Hilal in 1927. It was fairly late. It was in one of the later editions of Al-Hilal. The term nation and thus nationalism relied too heavily, he argued, on ascriptive notions. And this ran counter to the spirit of universal humanity or insaniyat, and its access to the entire planet or the mundane world, which he argued was the common inheritance of all humanity or arsiyat. John Willis, who has written quite a bit on Azad, argues that while the claim of insaniyat as a fundamental tenet of Islam was not novel within Islamic thought. Azad's assertion that it was an eternal truth to which believers must bear witness was unique. And Azad's emphasis on arsiyat was also distinctive. In contrast to these universals, he argued that nationalism and patriotism signified contingent moments in history and should not be considered permanent states of being. Political membership in a nation indicated an expansion from affiliations to one's ascriptive identities of family or tribe. However, such a form of friendship remained caught in demonstrating one's patriotism, race, affiliation to homeland, and nationality, rather than treating membership in a political community as a means of knowing the others who one shared that community with. And therefore, as a historically contingent norm, nationalism was accompanied by the drawing of boundaries around what was to be protected, but these boundaries often transformed protection into prejudice, and the prejudices of a nation inevitably manifested themselves as an aggressive nationalism, which did not seek to protect itself, but to launch offenses against others. Pride emerged from drawing boundaries around structures that one wants to protect. Self-respect for both the community and individual lay in recognizing the value of self-knowledge and how self-knowledge emerged from knowing the others one shared a political community with. Azad's criticism of nationalism was not contradictory to his anti-colonialism. Commenting on the limits of political ideas drawn from Europe, Azad pointed out that even the staunchest defenders of democracy, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, drew a circle around concepts like human rights and liberty to constrain them to an idea of the nation defined by a social contract. These boundaries were initially framed, he argued, to protect a well-circumscribed community of free and equal citizens. However, this changed once European nationalities came to follow what he called the ancient Roman principle of imperialism and divided the world into superior and inferior nations. He saw this hierarchy in extending rights to communities as the basis of colonialism, whose conditions were made extremely pronounced by capitalism. And I quote from him, it's a translation. Once the sway of capitalism became more powerful, control and domination over human beings, which earlier took centuries to establish, could now be obtained by the capitalist within a few months. Close quotes. He was critical of communist anti-colonialism too, arguing that it was determined to overthrow not only the system of nationalism, but the whole fabric of the social system. And he very much saw his anti-colonialism as a form of world-making whose foundations lay in the whole fabric or the totality of involvements through which colonized subjects in general and people of the subcontinent in particular understood their ways of being in the world. Azad was also heavily influenced by Aristotle through traditions of falsafa, which sought to cultivate an openness to reason through a moderation, both in belief in the scripture and in understanding motion towards the exploration of higher truths, either via rational interpretation or Sufi practices. He recognized moderation as a political virtue, particularly in the midst of history or the movement of time. And he argued that an equilibrium ought to be arrived between historically contingent phenomena like nationalism and the imaginative universalism of insaniyat and arziyat. Azad found this equilibrium by developing his concept of a place or dwelling, as I have elaborated above. Human beings, he contended, develop an affinity for the place in which they live because the physical conditions of the place come to coordinate their course of their life. These conditions give them continuity and consistency of experience. In the shared experience of a place of habitation, sectarian affiliations of race and kinship also merge and lead to the growth of a collective feeling of consciousness that is a life of civility. It is in this merging that one realizes the universality of insaniyat. With the growth of civilization, larger settlements and more complex forms of placemaking would allow for a collective consciousness to assume broader meaning. The affinity to a place of those inhabiting it would expand out from larger areas of familiarity and also extend to whole countries. And it was this form of expansion in one sense of place that would give rise to arsiyat and call for the mobility that was actively pursued in the geographical worlds that anti-colonialism sought to access. Thus, place as the locality which gives man continuity and consistency of experience, as well as the site in which particular affiliations merged into a more general consciousness of common life, could mediate between particular constructs of collective life, like the proposals that Indian nationalism was putting forward and Islamic ideas, universal ideas of insaniyat and arsiyat. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit and move ahead. And we can come back to discussing this a little more in the question and answer round. But I want to move to Azad's critique of borders a little more. In the second conception of world making, which is also present in Azad's thought, he thought of world making as an active form of reconstructing and reshaping the world by envisioning new institutions when modern colonial empires lost direct control of their colonies. The justifications for this kind of world making lay in agentic participation of formerly colonized people in processes which were political, processes that could develop institutions that could coordinate a political vision for political community. He argued that such agentic modes of participation in public life would allow for both an individual or a collective reconstruction of the world. In this section, I will argue that Azad developed a conception of non-secular progress in order to agentically and participatorily reconstruct the world through his anti-colonial ideas. The world that Azad sought to shape or reconstruct was not entirely a new world. Rather, he sought to reconstruct a world centered in India, which colonialism had sought to erase, but whose foundations continue to exist through language, social norms, religious beliefs and practices, and cultural modes of existence and engagement. While he agentically and participatorily sought to build a new political community, he also consciously sought to combine and forefront different forms of world making drawn from Islamic ways of being in particular. Here, let me take a small diversion into liberal imperialism to understand the kind of world that Azad was contending against. It was never a secret that liberal empires justified imperial rule by spinning prejudiced arguments on the incapacity of colonized peoples to rule themselves. Civilizing the colonized was considered the moral responsibility of liberal empires. The British Empire was not just a carrier of liberalism to its colonies, but constitutively used it to justify its imperial project. And a leading justification for liberal imperialism was that it brought progress to colonized peoples. When the colonized began to revolt against their rule, particularly in 1857 in India, the British liberal empire shifted its position and cultivated cultural justifications for the rule of empire in its colonies. In India, for example, interpretations of Islam that sought to modernize the primary tenets of Islam to align them with the principles of modern Western science by elite North Indian Muslim intellectuals like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan were used by ideologues of the British Empire to depict itself as the leading site for much needed reform within Islam. The empire claimed the authority to do so by saying that colonial India was home to the largest number of Muslims in the world. Sir Syed's writings were portrayed as representing a desire and endorsement among all Muslims for reforming Islam and civilizing its various norms, laws, and practices. As the British Empire went about developing cultural justifications for itself, the British colonial apparatus in India sought to bind and crystallize customary, religious, social, and ethical worldviews that a cross-section of groups adhered to particular communities. Communities whose characteristics and boundaries came to be neatly defined by colonial anthropologists and bureaucrats. These practices form the substantive content of bringing progress to the colony as they used modern principles of government to organize, document, and hold all the information through which a bureaucratic apparatus could govern society. From the perspective of the colonial government, the worldviews of the people of India were no longer available as widespread, if not universal, philosophical systems of ideas influencing all the diverse people who dwelled in this world. Rather, they were limitedly viewed as religious beliefs of members of particular communities that the colonial apparatus associated with the worldview. A defining example of how widespread concepts that emerged from a worldview came to be tied to a particular group is the shift in how Islam came to be perceived during the colonial rule. As others like Talal Asad have shown, the term Islam shifted from being a verbal noun referred to an individual act of loyalty or submission to God, historically practiced in astonishingly ethically diverse ways, to a proper noun used to describe and represent a fixed set of religious convictions, practices, and systems of laws adhered to by one community of Muslims. By the end of the 19th century, therefore, Islam's earlier meanings had not simply lost pride of place to its significance as a proper noun, but it had also come to be seen primarily as a kind of sociological category, which could describe even heretical practices, which were usually considered non-Islamic. And Islam became what all Muslims did, rather than being viewed and understood as a concept imbued with ethical practices that shape a way of being that submits itself to God. The epistemic impact this had on the former pervasiveness, or if one can characterize it in this way, the former universality of colonized worldviews cannot be undermined. As a particularistic stance was established by colonial rule towards religious worldviews by attaching it only to particular communities who adhere to it. This alignment of worldviews around particular communities was used to perceive adversarial positions between such worldviews as a cause of conflict, and the translation of philosophical adversarial positions were seen as something that needed to be adjudicated, as moralities that ironically enough needed to be excluded from the ultimate site of conflict, which is politics, and submitted and subordinated to ideas, to other ideas, what the British considered to be political. However, as the Indian public emerged and grew in the early 20th century, the impossibility of doing this, that is, keeping religious arguments out of the public domain, was recognized by the empire. Political reforms were used to allow a policed and limited form of these arguments to enter into the public domain through various Government of India acts. And this increased the representation for colonized in liberal institutions which colonial rule had instituted in India. However, the earlier process of the crystallization of worldviews around particular communities implied that the religious views of these communities could be authoritatively represented in the public domain only by individuals belonging to that particular community and vice versa, which is, if you had to publicly depict a religious argument by an individual in the public domain, it would be taken as representative of the community as a whole. And therefore, What we had was the treatment of non-secular worldviews as objects that came to be represented by particular individuals in the public domain. This is what I call representative secularism in my work. And, I'm fairly critical of it because representative secularism changed the stance of the state towards religious worldviews, something that simply did not exist prior to colonial rule. We know the consequences of this. Representative secularism led to separate electorates in India, and eventually a territorial border was created between India and Pakistan so that groups who were identified as Muslim could be seen as distinct and be given a distinct homeland. Territorial borders came to be used to categorize Muslims as a separate political community. This led to partition. But for Azad, who stressed the importance of shared self-definitions, borders were being brought into existence to divide common interreligious imaginaries of shared spaces in the Indian subcontinent. He argued that circuits of discourse which had existed for centuries across worlds that connected India to places beyond the borders of colonial India were being destroyed by this. If diverse groups in India were to publicly acknowledge how these places and worldviews overlapped in India, then questions of social cooperation between diverse religious groups could be brought to the fore of the public domain more easily. This would also lead to greater self-knowledge of the ways in which Indians viewed the world prior to colonialism. India's residents could draw on ideas, paths, and materials that emerged beyond the bounded territories of colonial India in making claims in public political life. A clear example of the enduring legacy of Azad's critique of borders is the tendency in India and elsewhere to refer to the partition of India as the partition of India instead of the formation of Pakistan. In this historically enduring reference, borders in the decolonized world are acknowledged as historically contingent. They did not emerge from patterns of interaction that overlapped with a line on a map. Rather, colonial institutional processes created them to contain the flow and prior connections between different sides of these borders. For Azad, these flows form the grounds to understand an alternative imaginary of a world that was not structured by the nation state or modern empires alone. Now let me come to my next section, which I have titled Progress as Pluralism. While bringing religious arguments, how much time do I have?
You have 8 minutes left.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah. I can rush through a few. Okay, so let me move into this argument a little more. Now, for Azad, bringing religious arguments into the public political domain was something that was not something that he was doing alone. Many engaged in Indian politics acknowledged this as an important way to justify India's pluralism. Gandhi did it. Gandhi always said that politics cannot be separated from one's belief in God. And the passionate denunciation of the empire in his writings did not merely occur with regard to colonial activities in India, but extended to the work of the British Empire across Asia, the Americas, and Africa. Countering the construction of universality within liberalism, Azad proposed justifying plural political principles through an idea of universality that was grounded in concepts emerging from Islamic worldviews. Azad used liberal concepts, but he did not necessarily accept all their accompanying epistemic or ethical assumptions in order to critique how the colonial government had structured politics in India. In doing so, he recognized that liberal imperialism had imposed a standard of the universal as an evaluative criteria for how politics should be assessed in the colonies. He also recognized that the question of formulating and sustaining foundational political principles was not just a question central to liberalism, but was present in a variety of traditions with different moral vocabularies. Pluralism might have been a virtue that traditions outside of liberalism also valued. Azad was interested in how pluralism of non-liberal traditions created a form of universality to that of reason asserted by the British Empire. And we discussed a little bit of this earlier this morning. Azad used this conception of alternative universality to justify a pluralist aspiration for post-colonial India. He thought his aspirations were not just seeped in contesting the denial of dignity and rights to the colonial subjects, but he went a step ahead and argued that the form and substantive concepts of a progressive discourse should be rethought to criticize secular ideas in India. He contested the portrayal of religion as a homogeneous category by representative secularism. He did not follow a strategy of combining different forms of Islamic argument into a single text or a pamphlet. Rather, he explicitly employed a discursive strategy in the public domain, which distinguished between different religious forms of argument, such as religious commands from revealed texts, theological or moral doctrines, juridical debates emerging from historical contestations in fiqh, and references to practices found in religious traditions. He provided the appeal behind distinguishing between these different forms of religious arguments in very specific writings, speeches, and praxis. And this makes him one of the most methodologically conscious political thinkers of his time. He defended political and social diversity and provided Islamic constructions for a plural political conception using theological arguments in his Tarjuman al-Quran. He used genealogically constructed arguments in his Tazkira. He used political theoretical conceptions on self-rule and distributive justice in his Congress presidential addresses, the most famous of which is his 1940 Rampur presidential address. And he produced fiqhi or Islamic jurisprudential arguments in various texts and various fatwas that he wrote over time. Demonstrating the distinctions between different forms of Islamic argument allowed him to make a variety of Islamic concepts and vocabulary accessible to the public domain in India, letting both Muslims and non-Muslims engage with them in the variety that they presented. Breaking down Islamic ideas into different forms revealed several bases of political engagement, each with a greater or lesser degree of appeal to India's diverse publics. Islamic arguments publicly presented in this way held an appeal not just as private moral motivations, but as multiple sources of knowledge which could address problems of politics. It demonstrated that the debate on religious reasons in the public sphere cannot be worded as such because there is no such thing as a single form of Islamic argument. It also indicated that some forms of argument could be translated relatively easily into other moral languages, like that of the law, but others couldn't. And therefore, in some cases, it made a stronger case for the acceptability of an Islamic argument. In employing this discursive strategy, he demonstrated that Islamic arguments need not be evaluated merely on grounds of being religious, but could be made available for deliberative engagement through different typologies considered to be Islamic. I have only 3 minutes left. I wanted to go into his argument on Rububiyat, Rahmat, and Adalat in the Tarjuman, but we can leave it to question answers later. Let me come to why I think Azad's thought has been sidelined. With populist nationalism increasingly structuring our contemporary world, questions on how the grounds for anti-colonialism should be judged appear to have ready-made answers within the nationalist public, which constantly prioritize the nation above all else. The rise of Hindu nationalism in India has brought to the fore tensions between the pluralist world centered in India that Azad's anti-colonialism sought and the world that shapes what is now a global imagination of Hindutva. Majoritarian nationalism demands from everyone that they construe their worlds in the vocabulary of nationalism, where the only political imaginary that is permissible is a nationalist imaginary. And this has rendered unseen political imaginaries of a world that were pluralist and did not constantly appeal to nationalism in order to share a world with others. In this hyper-national context, Azad's ideas of world-making are conflated with writings on constitutionalism or the demands for the accommodation of Muslim identity within the Indian nation. And I think this is a very reductive reading of Azad. The presence and use of Islamic vocabularies, traditions, and imaginaries in Indian politics, which Azad argued should not be confined to Muslims alone, but allowed, but be opened up for interpretations from non-Muslims as well, has now become, is now considered dangerous in a place where Islam has existed since the Prophet was alive. Indian Muslims have to constantly keep correcting what they mention in the public domain, and therefore this universalist discourse, which Azad so heavily defended, that comes from an Islamic imaginary, but is not confined to believers of Islam alone, has lost its traction in the public domain. I think that the blame does not lie with Hindu nationalism alone. Even Indian secularism, which at the time of independence contained a sensitivity to Islamic ideas as universal ideas, now sees it through the particularist lens of religious ideas of a particular community alone. Why is this the case? I think I think the answer can be found in the enduring impact of liberal imperialism's imposition of representative secularism on India and its restructuring of the Indian political domain as a liberal political domain. I think there are problems and limitations on how liberals, including Nehruvian liberals, see secularism. And I think Azad provides a critique of it, which has today been sidelined. And therefore, I think we can do a lot more using Azad's arguments in order to question whether Indian secularism can truly be plural. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Shaunna. There's a lot of speculation about what we're going to about. But I think the consensus was will be a very enriching one, certainly was. So let me just kind of throw forward a few points which you can respond if you want to, but this is by way of provocation so that we floor questions from the floor. The term, there are a number of terms that you use in the title. Let me take the first, world making. Because when you started talking about world making, immediately I juxtaposed in my mind Azad's world making to Nehru's nation building. Now, it's quite remarkable because as I was listening to you, the way that I tried to understand world making was to imbue a certain sense of meaning into the world. Whereas when you think of nation building, you think of, construction and putting up infrastructure, temples of democracy, and there's a certain kind of a physicality to nation building. Whereas world making has a certain kind of an ethical imbuing of the world to see oneself want to live in a certain kind of environment. So the last point that you made was a point that I readily agree with, that the Nehruvian worldview, not now, but has so pervaded India in the 14 years of Nehru being the prime minister, and of course the Nehruvian consensus, as we call it, that it completely ruled out any possibility of a world making of this kind. So that's the first set of ideas that was going through my mind as I was listening to you. Let me make a second point, which is more of a direct question. What would you think are the what is the impetus behind the world making that Azad, that you seem to kind of credit to Azad? Let me give an example of this. Every time I read someone like Hannah Arendt, for example, the one thing that strikes me is amor mundi, the love of the world that she talks about. So could a love of the world of the kind that Arendt, for example, is talking about be the impetus or the motive behind an idea like it's world making? So that's one set of ideas that I wanted to kind of put forward. Let me come to another set of themes that I was thinking about as you were speaking. Now, this has to do with the kind of pluralism that you're talking about, you find in Azad, which again, I mostly agree with you, most of the points that you make in this paper. But the critique of what you call representative secularism is interesting because it has a certain kind of a self-limiting quality to it. It is premised upon a certain linearity of progress, whereby all other forms of progress are ruled out from the very beginning. So what we are then talking about is the possibility of bringing in other worldviews which may be non-liberal, but which would then have the possibility of contributing to a certain notion of universalism that liberalism denies to them. Okay. Now, when you make a point like this, you come very close to someone like Alistair MacIntyre, in whose Justice with Rationality, where he says, well, I mean, liberalism is one tradition amongst many others, but it had the audacity to claim universalism, which was denied to many, many other traditions. So would you be approaching a position of that particular kind when you make this point? Let me come to perhaps the last point that I shouldn't go on for too long because I'd be kind of saying too many things. But let me just confine myself to this last point, which is that given the fraught hyper-national times that we live in, how do we make an argument of this kind? I mean, it's a fraught thing to critique Nehru these days because one has the possibility of sliding into a certain kind of Hindutva logic. So how do we negotiate this? I'll give you a concrete example of this. Some years ago, I was giving a talk in a Delhi University college. Now, given my Muslim identity and my name, so someone asked me, oh, why can't you be like not Maulana Azad, but Abul Kalam, right? You've been asked that question, right? So my immediate response to that was, I quoted Muhammad Ali and I said, the boxer, Muhammad Ali, said, I don't have to be what you want me to be. Now, the point is that in the kind of bipolarities that we live in, how do we open up the kind of pluralism that you're talking about? Because I find it well nigh impossible to open up the ground for pluralities in between these tyrannical binaries and bipolarities that seem to be crushing our lives between the scalar and characteristics that we face. All right, that's all that I have to say. Should I open the floor for questions, or would you want to respond to this? It's your choice. Okay, right. So good. Right. Okay. So questions from the floor. Imtiaz, should we collect questions or do? Okay. So Imtiaz, why don't you go first? And
can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for your paper. I have. Hello. So my first question relates to your discussion of world making in Azad. I was particularly struck by your discussion of how in Azad there is a study of the total involvement of the people in linguistic, religious, and other dimensions of life. Now, while I was very struck by this focus on world making, and especially the role of converting a particular space into a place, and I can see in the back of my mind the importance of territory in thinking about world making. You also mentioned that in the 1920s there was the caliphate, which Azad was not fully able to explain with his theory. Now, starting from here, I want to ask you a question. Now, suppose there are certain symbols in a faith which are held to be very sacred, and I'm thinking here of the figure of the Prophet Muhammad and the importance that is assigned to him. Now, how would you say that when a symbol like this is critiqued or or is unnecessarily drawn into some controversy, the reaction that happens is usually cross-cutting the boundaries of nation state. And so different authors can give different reasons for this. Like, for example, Faisal Devji would argue that here a critique of the figure of the Prophet, in fact, the reaction that it provokes shows the limits of the nation state and limits of liberal democracy to address a particular this problem within the confine of the law. And so he says that here we can think about internationalism within Islamic thought, and that is centered around the figure of the Prophet. So if you could tell us a little bit more about internationalism, and you mentioned this is not Marxist internationalism. So what is internationalism in Azad's thought, while rooted to a philosophy of world making and place making? If I'm allowed a slightly longer comment, I actually, when I was listening to you, I was thinking of Sher Ali Tareen, this scholar who has written Defending Muhammad in Modernity. And in fact, in his work, he begins with a study of the debate between the Barelvis and the Deobandis about celebrating Eid Miladun Nabi, the birthday of the Prophet. And while it's a cultural practice deeply rooted, he shows how the debate is not merely theological, but also reflects a certain anxiety about loss of sovereignty. And so the Prophet becomes the figure of sovereignty, and why defending him is so important. So this leads me to my second question, which is that in defending a certain post-colonial reading, and while I agree with you that epistemic violence of liberal secularism, restructuring the public sphere, has completely removed the cultural symbols from public spaces, I would urge you not to think of these as two opposed binaries, that as it were one replaces the other. In certain post-colonial literature, like say Partha Chatterjee's derivative discourse, he arrives at some of the conclusions by juxtaposing Gandhi and Nehru against one another. And the kind of stark findings of the book are in fact a result of placing Gandhi and Nehru, as it were, in this kind of juxtaposition. But look at it. So if we were not to think of these two spaces as binary opposites to one another, you could still open up a discussion of, let's say, the Bharat Jodo Yatra. Okay, and here the reason I'm bringing this Bharat Jodo Yatra is because Gandhi, in his entire discussion, is very careful not to think of ends all the time. He's not thinking about what will future India look like. He's thinking about what are the means. He's not interested in making an abstract blueprint. In fact, every time Nehru asks Gandhi, can you give us an economic blueprint for what future India will look like, or farmers are asking what future India would look like, Gandhi would dismiss it. His contribution in developing a method like Ahimsa and Satyagraha was primarily to focus on the means. And these means have not been fully eclipsed by, say, Nehruvian secularism or by the governmental institutions of modern state, or so I would argue. And you see that every time that a Bharat Jodo Yatra is invoked, you're in fact trying to bring back that kind of a rooted practice back into political life. And that is the resource that is left for us. So I would urge you to think how Azad's pluralism is also rooted in certain lived practices, not in ideologies or institutions, but in certain lived practices that continue to have a lot of balance even in today's India. But thank you. I must say I learned a lot from your paper, and I wish you all the best.
Danish?
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Much of what I planned to bring up has been fleshed out
sorry.
by you and Dr. Imtiaz. Nonetheless, very quickly, what caught my attention was your use of world making. And as you unpacked the concept, I couldn't help but get reminded of Said's worldliness. Although I'm not very sure whether you will name your approach to Azad as a post-colonial approach, because that raises a different set of questions. That whether we can read Azad as a from a post-colonial perspective, particularly because Said's worldliness touches upon the question of filiation and actively how you are. He's talking about this in the context of texts and critics and the world that we make in the process and the affiliations that we constitute, so to speak. The second point that got me thinking was again, which he hinted towards, is to do with representative secularism. Now, as a critical phrase that takes issue with secularism, not in the sense that anti-modernity talks about, but probably, if I got you correctly, you have used this phrase in order to understand that how it resituates religion. And this is thinking aloud, if you allow me. If one were to imagine that we were to pursue Azad's persuasion here, because representative secularism is an outright institutional mechanism. So what could be the modality of the kind of participation at a transnational, extra-national, if one could say, non-national, on a non-national plane that you are trying to articulate? Is it something that can take root of popular culture or a cultural practice or sensibilities? Or how can it actually replace the institutional mechanism? We can think about tolerance as an illustration in that direction, that how tolerance can be practiced. So what could be an alternative structure, as you said, to non-representative secularism while addressing tolerance? Thank you.
Okay, okay. Go ahead. Then we'll have another round.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Is this working? I think it is. Okay. So, okay, thank you for all of these questions. And, of course, so much to think about. I think, just to clarify, I think the term world making is coming from two different thinkers, and they're connected in many ways, but they were different thinkers. The first is Martin Heidegger, who, developed a conception of world making as the ways in which beings exist in time. And the second is his student, Hannah Arendt, who criticizes Heidegger and says, the world is not just something that we are thrown into, but something that we actively make and remake, And so the world that we exist in is not the entire planet, but it's the world in which our context can extend, So this university, for example, is part of an Urdu-speaking world, It is also part of an Indian world, and it is part of an academic world. So there are these different overlapping involvements that begin to make a world. And I think Azad is someone who's very sensitive to that kind of involvement. And unlike Nehru, whose nation building was partly statesman-like and partly driven by the agenda of development, of scientific progress, I don't think Azad was critical of that as much as maybe he should have been. But Azad was constantly trying to emphasize something else, besides that. And he was constantly reminding everyone that if we don't consider this way in which we have always lived together, in which we have always mutually coexisted, and in which whether we love or hate each other, we somehow understand each other, we would be losing out on something that is very essential to building a political community. And that's why I think centering his thought in this concept is helpful. And I think what is the impetus behind the world making that I credit Azad with? I think that's an important question. I think going back to my paper, since he's such a methodological thinker, he's able to draw impetuses for world making from different sources. So when he writes the Tarjuma, he starts with Rububiyat, and he says it's God's providence through which we don't just live in an Anthropocene world, we live in a world which is full of nature. We're able to, appreciate the beauty of this, the world that we share, other creatures that we share our universe with. When it comes to fatwas that he passes, he refers to built spaces, practices through which people approach mosques, and he wrote fatwas for different kinds of Muslims. He was approached by diverse sets of people, and he was able to speak to that kind of practice. I think that is, and Imtiaz, I think you're right. Because I am someone who is an abstract thinker, I have focused more on the abstraction in his thinking. But going ahead, I would, try to overcome my own limitations and, maybe, go through how he explores lived practice more. And so there are these different methodological approaches that he takes to develop this conception of world making. And then he borrows an Arendtian kind of world making. When he's sitting in places like the Constituent Assembly debates, he's sitting in Minority Commission. There's this subcommittee report on the Commission for Minority Rights in India, and Jayapal Singh, comes up to that subcommittee which Azad was heading, and he was talking about how rice liquor, which is commonly drunk by the tribals of Ranchi, scheduled tribe communities of Ranchi, should be recognized as sacred by the Indian government. And there is an exchange, and Azad knew Jayapal Singh well because Azad lived in, he was interned in Ranchi for a long time. And Azad tells him, what does this have to do with religion, And Jayapal Singh tells him it's religious to the Santals, and the Indian government should be able to recognize this. And Azad accepts that position. And so, here is an active form of world making with this kind of deliberative participation in shaping democratic norms forces Azad, as well as Jayapal Singh, to be able to converse on two positions which might otherwise not have met very easily. Though I think Azad was fairly tolerant about these things. He was a very tolerant man, as we learned this morning. Now, let me come to, maybe, Azad does talk about love fairly often in, letters that he exchanges with Nehru. There's also in his early life where he's fairly influenced by, these relationships that he had, which Professor Habib writes about in his book. But I think his world making comes from different sources, and that's to his credit as a thinker. Now let's go to representative secularism. Definitely, I'm wholly in agreement with you. This kind of liberal march of progress is something that liberal imperialism imposed on India, and I think Indian politics has accepted without thinking about the way in which society interacts with politics when it comes to progress. And to a large extent, we could credit the rise of Hindu nationalism with this kind, with the resentment that, Hindu nationalists have towards the kind of linear progress instituted by liberalism in India. Of course, Alistair McIntyre makes this argument, and I accept that argument of McIntyre does not mean that I accept the rest of his arguments. I think I accept that progress should not be simply linear and that there are diverse ways in which progress can take place. And this is something that, I constantly feel even when it comes to scientific progress. For example, when I'm in India, I can barely pay with credit cards, and in the States where I live, everyone thinks that the credit card is the path into the future, whereas here everyone is using Google Pay or whatever it is. And so progress is divergent. It's constantly how the world works. And, there is a myth of the linearity of progress on which political institutions constantly try to set the norm. And I think Indian democracy is clearly an indication that this is not true. There is a reason why we have not resolved problems, because resolving problems does not necessarily set us on one single path into the future. So there, I definitely adopt a post-colonial position. There's definitely the work of Chakrabarti, and more recently, critical theorists like Amy Allen, etc., who are beginning to talk about how there is a form of social progress that might be based on the ways in which society develops cumulative forms of learning. Both, Azad, like other thinkers in India, Ambedkar, for example, believed that progress could be gained through an expansion of knowledge. And this is something that, Professor Habib talks about in his book. An expansion of knowledge means greater progress. And for Azad, this expansion of knowledge comes from knowing more about the others one lives with. So when he found out from Jaipal Singh that, rice beer is sacred, that was progress. One might contest this question, but I think it is crucial to the way in which Azad thought about pluralism and political possibilities in India. Am I taking too much time? No? Okay.
Finish your train of thought.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now, so let me come to this big question that you asked me, Professor Ali. We live in a dichotomized world. At least politics today in India, despite being a multi-party democracy, is so dichotomized that any position is either the RSS position or not. There is a diversity, I think, even within the RSS, which we are enough, and which is something that we could pursue. But, your question is, why can't we, how do we open the ground for the kind of pluralities that we are talking about? I think there are different ways in which we can do this. And one major way is to say, let us begin to acknowledge religious arguments or arguments that we have considered religious in the public domain. Now, this is not an argument just I am making or just Azad is making. This is also an argument made by other people like Gandhi and Ambedkar. Most people forget that the annihilation of caste ends with Ambedkar saying we should be able to bring religious arguments into the public domain so that we can criticize them. And without criticizing, Hindu scriptures, how are we going to annihilate caste? So this is, I think Nehruvian secularism has done a lot to sideline that kind of argument. And Gandhi, of course, constantly forefronted religion when he talked about politics. So can the RSS be opposed to that kind of argument? In form, no, because in form, they also say that we should be able to bring religious arguments in the public domain. Now, whether those arguments are religious or not is up for, a separate debate. And so where will that lead to? I don't know. I cannot predict. But I think that is definitely one path forward, because most of us understand the world in that way, and our politics should be based upon how we understand the world, not based on how someone else wants us to understand the world. Okay, now let me come finally to the question of blasphemy, which Imtiaz raised. Is the universality of Islam based on the sacredness of the Prophet? Maybe. I'm not a scholar of that, so I don't know. I don't want to make a statement on that. I think the universality. There are many concepts in Islam which are universal. Insaniyat and Arziyat, for example, in Azad's thought, and something that Azad and many other critical theorists like Talal Asad have argued is that critique does not have to be secular. And so when, different people begin to criticize those who are against blasphemy, who say, don't bring this up in the public domain. It is offensive and so deeply offensive that it is enough to cause very fraught relations in the public. I think democracies, whether they are liberal or not, should be able to develop a tolerance towards that kind of argument. And I think, I've made this point several times before. I think liberal toleration has its limits. It has its limits because it has kept what matters to people, like religious worldviews, outside the public domain. And therefore, we don't really know what other people are thinking. We're constantly saying we have to think about 1 to 3 lines, and 4 to 20 has to be kept outside the public domain. So where is the tolerance? There is no tolerance. That seems to be a very intolerant way of pluralism. So again, I think knowledge of others, gaining deeper knowledge of others is the path forward towards developing a better non-liberal form of tolerance, which can, if not resolve questions of blasphemy, at least address them in a more considerate and plural way. Okay. On the Said question, I think Said's, if I can be a little critical, I think at the end of the day, Said is looking at literary texts. And, like Imtiaz urged me, look at the lived practices of people. Or like you are saying, representative secularism is simply about institutions. And Azad is able to, like I said, do this from different methods. He uses literary methods in Gubare Khatir, but he's also able to, use theological forms, or juridical forms, or secular forms when he had to, like his Ramgarh address, Rampur address. So is the worldliness the same as world making? I think Said definitely took that term from Heidegger and, reshaped it as something that is more material because of his own leanings, his sort of Foucauldian leanings. I don't want to only do a Foucauldian reading of Azad, though representative secularism definitely comes from that kind of literature. But I think what Azad gives us is definitely a sense that we make the world through words. We make the world through how we speak to each other. And again, knowledge is important. Okay, I'll stop here. I spoke a lot, so sorry.
Very honestly addressed every single point, so that's to your credit. And just looking at the room for other hands, as I do so, let me just add 2 points responding to what you just said. The point about liberalism, I completely agree. There's a certain kind of a narrow spectrum through which we look at liberalism. It's usually the narrow spectrum through which we look at tolerance. When we think of tolerance, we think of John Locke's 1685 letter to Liberty Toleration. Locke wrote 3,000 words of toleration, 3,000 pages of toleration in a span of like 17, 18 years. Now, I realize a lot of people don't look at that. And it's important to be able to kind of make the concept of tolerance much more capacious, and therefore other non-liberal notions of toleration must be looked at. Now, this brings me to another point that I wanted to really press because of my own misgivings about the post-colonial framework that you seem to privilege so much. Now, my point about the post-colonial framework has to do with a certain discomfort that I've already had. Now, this has to do with the fact that, philosophically speaking, the stance that post-colonialism has taken towards the Enlightenment, which is a certain kind of a dislike towards Enlightenment, which I endorse, it commits itself to a position of a complete rejection of the Enlightenment. And what that prevents it from doing is to be able to understand that there are other forms of Enlightenment. I think the Grammy talks about them. the 17th century, early radical enlightenment. And this is one of my major misgivings with the post-colonial framework in terms of its philosophical positioning towards enlightenment. Now, the reason why I say this is when I look at the fraught politics of the world, let's hope Trump never comes back. But what Trump has done in those 4 years that he was here, or what is happening in India right now, or what happened in Brexit Britain, to my mind, is a politics that is bereft of any notion of the Enlightenment, which to my mind is a significant a commitment towards some notion, not the mainstream 18th century Enlightenment, but some notion of enlightenment as an acknowledgement of the possible progress that humanity can make. To my mind is important, and which is why I personally am so much against the post-colonial framework that is obviously so much part of your paper. So I just wanted to express that particular misgiving that I had with that particular part of your paper. You might want to respond to it immediately or perhaps sometime later. I'm still looking at the raised hands and I can't see any. Professor Deep.
I just wanted you to you use this expression liberal liberalism. I don't understand what you mean by liberal liberalism. What is the context?
Liberal liberalism, how
How do you explain the usage of liberal liberalism in what context? And another instance I just wanted to add to the world making of Maulana Abul you're talking about, like in 1955-56, Khwaja Hassan Nizami of Nizamuddin Dargah asked Gulzar Dehlvi, who died a couple of years ago, a very well-known Urdu poet, who was a young man in 1950s, and he was supposed to be very close to Maulana Azad, and you had access to him. So Hassan Nizami, he told him that, can you request Maulana Azad to come and be part of Jashn Khusro, which they were going to celebrate. And Gulzar has organized Jashn Mir, Jashn Dagh, before, and invited Maulana Azad. So Hassan Nizami felt that he had that access, and he went. So when he told him, he said, no, Azad is not known to be part of this world. He's an admirer of Ibn Taymiyyah. So that was again a very serious misgiving about Maulana Azad. So Gulzar one day raised this issue with Maulana Azad, and Maulana said, but why me? He said, oh, Hassan Nizami is very keen that you come. He said, okay, but I will come only for 45 minutes. He said, okay. He goes there to Nizamuddin, he speaks for 2 hours on Khusro, and he speaks like an authority. No issue of Ibn Taymiyyah. I think he creates his own space over there. And that was a lesson for people who had a view about Azad in those times. And so there was, I have referred it to in my book also. That was something revealing about him. Now, when the Qawwali session began, then Gulzar came and said in his ears, he said, "Ab lagta hai aapko chale jaye to behtar hai." Before Qawwali, he said, okay. I said, okay, theek hai. So he spent 2.5 hours. So that was the eclectic spirit of Maulana Azad. You can't slot him. That he's a Ibn Taymiyyah admirer, or he's a so he could create his own.
I think that's what makes him remarkable as a political figure. If he was simply consistent, I don't think he would have been able to produce the new kind of this new kind of pluralism that he very strongly proposed. What a wonderful story. I'm feeling, and I think that's what. So let me just move into 2 questions, and maybe one follows from the other. So by liberal imperialism, I'm borrowing from a few, political theorists, mostly like Uday Mehta, Jennifer Pitts, and today there's a wide variety of scholarship of arguments which demonstrate that British imperialism was liberal, unlike Spanish imperialism or the French or the Japanese, basically who just sort of conquer colonized lands. And because they drew on liberal principles to constantly rule, and justify their rule in colonies by saying that we are taking development and progress to colonies. We're basically civilizing colonies by teaching them liberalism. Uday Mehta coins this term liberal imperialism, which I just use, for the benefit of time. But I think I agree with him. I think that the idea that liberalism has been imperial and has imperial roots is a fairly valuable one, one that helps us understand a lot of inequalities that liberalism has enabled. Moving into, I think, post-colonial theory and its position towards the Enlightenment, I definitely agree. I think post-colonial theory moved from reading Marx and Foucault and rarely ever reading Enlightenment traditions, even if we are referring to, central Enlightenment thinkers like Kant or Hegel. And I think what, post-colonial theory has proceeded by constantly using a term West without necessarily taking into consideration how plural and diverse and contested this, even the discourse of the West is. And so, and I've often found post-colonial theory has never really taken on the major figures of the Enlightenment, they've not disproven Kant. They've not said that, something like a moral law is something that people don't think about. And so I think it's definitely post-colonial theory's failing, but it was not Azad's failing. And I think Azad is someone who engaged with a liberal constitution at the end of the day. He sat through a constitution-making process with hundreds of liberals and some conservatives, but he was able to engage with liberal thought by finding what is common between liberalism and other kinds of pluralism, but providing a justification for pluralist ideas that did not come from liberalism. So it's his eclecticism. I don't think that necessarily means he's intellectually poor. I think it makes him intellectually original and a far more creative thinker than most other people in India's Constituent Assembly. So, yeah.
Okay, I'm looking at the students especially, because it's actually for the students that all of this is done. So if students have a question, I would really privilege their point of view on their question. So I know that it's vacation time, but any student who has a question, otherwise I will try to bring the session to an end. It has gone on for quite some time. No one. Last chance, injury time. So, if there are no further questions, then it is my happy task to bring this session to an end. Thank you very much, Shaunna. It has been most enriching listening to you and engaging with these ideas, these questions. I hope help you develop this. Thank you. And of course, the conversation continues, so we won't let you go.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, I think there was